Hi there, boys and girls. Time for story time with Mr. Riddle. Today we're going to read Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. I remember reading these books when I was a kid. Let's get started. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat. And the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate. And the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so it went on. He just kept eating and eating. And it made him even more hungry. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of house. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. He had been dreaming about food, as usual, and that had made him wake up feeling hungry, as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up and went downstairs and ate the most enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had for breakfast. Toast, 2 slices. Cornflakes, 1 packet. Milk, 1 bottle. Sugar, 1 bowlful. Toast, 3 more slices. Eggs, 3 boiled. Toast, 4 more slices. Butter, 1 whole dish. Marmalade, that's jelly, 1 pot. There's a picture of the eggs. When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair and smiled a very satisfied smile, and thought that was a delicious breakfast. He thought to himself, now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch. It was already lunchtime. He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he should probably go on a walk. It's always fun taking walks. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then he discovered a cave. That's funny, he thought. I don't remember seeing that before. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upward. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb. But with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was, without the doubt, the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen, and it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that rather large door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there, before him, was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world! The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house. The chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on top of that gigantic table was the most delicious food smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Look how big the table and chairs are. It's pretty big. Mr. Greedy sniffed again, and then decided that he must get to the top of that table. So he began to climb up the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult and took quite a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. They were as big as he was. Pretty big. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges. Oranges are healthy for you, aren't they? Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Then he looked around. Apples are healthy. On the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. And on the plate, and on the plate, huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages the size of pillows, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes the size of beach balls, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate, and being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand and looking into the eyes of a real-life giant. "And who," thundered the giant, "are you?" Mr. Greedy was so frightened he could only manage to squeak out his name. "Mr. Greedy," he squeaked. The giant laughed a laugh as loud as thunder. "Greedy by name and greedy by nature," he bellowed. "Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson." Oh dear, what's going to happen? And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst any minute. "Now," said the giant, "do you promise never to be greedy again?" "Oh yes," moaned Mr. Greedy, "I promise." Remember, if you eat too much, you can get a tummy ache. That's why you can't eat all your candy at Halloween. You got to save a little bit. "Very well," said the giant. "Then I will let you go." Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door feeling very fat and extremely miserable. He had to eat all of the food. And do you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. He now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? So if you know anybody who's as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you? Tell them to beware of giants. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story of Mr. Greedy. Remember to watch out for giants. I like the stories that Roger Hargreaves writes. He has several different ones, and we've read several of them in class. Each of the little pictures are different characters in his storybooks. He writes all the Mr. books and the little Miss books. Maybe tomorrow we'll read another one. See you later. Bye-bye.